Once upon a time, not in the age of steel and combustion, but in the time of swords and sandals, the world moved to the left. Before cars, before asphalt, before traffic lights blinked red into the night, there was only the path and the traveler. And on that path, human instinct and practicality chose a side. In a world where strangers on the road might carry a blade as readily as they carried bread, people traveled defensively. Most were right-handed, so they walked or rode on the left side of the road. This kept their sword hand free, close to oncoming travelers, ready to draw steel if danger emerged. And with each collapse, chaos finds the cracks. In the north and west, what would one day be England, Scotland, Ireland, the tradition of left-hand travel remained like a ghost of Rome. In the continent, however, new habits emerged. And should they need to mount a horse, they did so from the left too, for the sword hung on the left hip, and mounting from the left kept it from tangling or striking the beast. It was not a law, it was not a custom carved into stone, but it was a practice born of survival and suspicion. From the British Isles to the sands of Africa, from the ports of Hispania to the furthest reaches of Gaul, their legions marched on the left. You were an enemy of revolution, you were modern. You were a child of the Enlightenment, you were part of the New Order, you were British. The left side remained sacred. Parliament codified it in 1835. All roads in the United Kingdom would mandate travel on the left. A new power was rumbling into existence. A mechanical beast, coughing smoke and growling on wheels. What had once been custom was now law. You were backward. Chariots, too, were driven that way-worn grooves in Roman roads prove it, the left side more deeply etched from centuries of iron-shod wheels. This was the way of the Roman Empire. As more people drove, chaos returned. Intersections snarled. Streets clogged, accidents surged. Every country had to choose, left or right. In those days, movement was a matter of power and prestige. The side one traveled on was more than convenience. It was order. It was Rome, and as the empire spread, so too did its leftward logic. It was not logical, and so history was reversed. Mostly former British colonies: India, Australia, South Africa, New Zealand. Their roads still echo with the footfalls of imperial rule. It was not final. At 5 a.m., traffic stopped. All cars moved slowly, carefully to the right side. And from that moment, Sweden was a right-driving nation. Others, their neighbors. Some made their decisions out of practicality, others out of pride. It is a story of empire, rebellion, pride, and practicality. The Empire of Japan, as it industrialized, chose the left. But empires crumble. After Rome's fall, medieval Europe splintered. Feudal lords rose, kings fell, roads decayed, and customs shifted. One man, more than any other, would tip the balance. His name, Napoleon Bonaparte. When he marched, he wanted uniformity. His armies, in grand processions of conquest, began traveling on the right side of the road. The conquered followed. Spain, Italy, the Netherlands, and much of Germany all pulled into his gravitational pull, shifted their traffic to the right. The old Roman way was thrown aside as the Frenchman's star rose. Small in stature, great in ambition, and fond of overturning everything in his path, including traffic customs. Napoleon was left-handed. He was also a military man with a taste for precision. It became more than mere function. It was politics, travel on the left, travel on the right. Thus, roadways turned into battlefields of symbolism. Wheels rolled not just over dirt and stone, but over history, over ideology. Across the Channel in Great Britain, there was resistance. Deep, stubborn, unyielding. The British did not yield to Napoleon in war, nor did they yield in how they drove their carriages. Yet, in a world beginning to fracture under industry and empire, the question of left or right was no longer confined to dusty roads and royal edicts, the automobile. Born in the late 19th century, the car had no allegiances. It was not Roman or Napoleonic. It simply demanded rules. Some followed their colonial rulers, and thus the world divided. It was not even. In Japan, samurai tradition echoed the Roman way. They too wore swords on the left, mounted from the left, and rode left. In Sweden, people drove on the left until 1967, on a day known as Högertrafiken or Dagen. 7 million Swedes changed sides overnight, literally. But why? Why did Sweden, and others like it, change? The answer lies not in swords or empires, but in something far more modern: neighbors. Sweden's neighbors, Norway, Finland, Denmark, drove on the right. Cross-border confusion led to collisions and chaos. Commerce demanded conformity. Integration required it. Today, only 35% of the world drives on the left. But the reasons are often forgotten. Most drivers, eyes on the road, hands on the wheel, never wonder, why am I on this side? Yet the answer is written in wars and revolutions, in sword fights and steam engines. The road, like history, bends. And so we begin our journey, 15 parts through time, tired tracks across centuries, to answer a question so ordinary, so unnoticed, that it might just lull you to sleep. Why do some countries drive on the left? The answer begins here, in the shadows of the road, where the past rides quietly beside us. Long before ink met parchment, long before the idea of a country even existed, there was the sword. Not the kind displayed in glass cases, but the kind strapped to the waist of every traveler, soldier, and nobleman. Cold iron resting on the left hip, ready to be drawn with the right hand. This simple fact, a blade's placement, would echo across centuries and continents, silently choosing which side of the road entire nations would one day favor. It began with instinct. When two travelers approached each other on a narrow road, both with blades, both strangers, they chose what felt safest. Not because of theology, but because of order. He had seen too many holy men and women jostling and clashing in the narrow streets. Faith needed formality, even piety needed traffic rules. To pass on the left was to keep one's sword hand between oneself and a potential threat. The pattern became tradition, which was then choked with carts, wagons, horses, and footmen. Chaos ruled until the city had to draw a line, or rather, a side. The tradition became law. The risk of clashing hilts or brushing shoulders was more than inconvenience, it was insult. Why? So they could keep their dominant right hand free to whip the team? This made it easier to see oncoming traffic if they kept to the right side of the road, passing others on their left. In a society built on honor and hierarchy, a simple misstep could provoke bloodshed. And that included the old custom of driving on the left, the side of the elite. The mob rejected it. They moved to the right. Symbolism became policy. And when Napoleon rose from the flames of revolution, he institutionalized it. So the samurai passed on the left, rode on the left, and through them, Japan's future was quietly decided. To ride on the left was to keep the scabbard clear and the draw swift. A handshake didn't exist yet, but the right hand was already a signal of power, of peace, or of violence. Always the right hand. Always the same calculation, be ready. And its colonies drove on the left while most of the continent of Europe and its allies rolled to the right. This habit became a pattern. Where they rolled, left or right, told you who had ruled and who had resisted. In many regions, the upper classes demanded that others step aside, quite literally, and allow them to pass on whichever side they pleased. It rejected British customs wholesale, including traffic behavior. In Australia and New Zealand, the first carriages followed the old romang habit. These wagons, pulled by multiple horses, were often steered without a driver's seat. Other states followed. By the time the automobile arrived, the U.S. was firmly on the right and influencing its southern neighbors to do the same. To drive on the left was to be English, and the Americans were no longer English. Instead, the driver rode the rear left horse, holding reins across the entire team. From this position, it was easier to see oncoming traffic if everyone kept to the right. Left driving slowly receded in the New World, replaced by the rhythm of right-hand traffic. The direction of travel is a palimpsest, a page overwritten again and again but never fully erased. In South Africa, Hong Kong, the Caribbean, and beyond, colonial rule laid down roads and rules alike. In the 1800s, this left-right question wasn't just a quirk of geography. It was an emblem of who you belonged to. It was efficient, it was European, and it kept commerce moving in one unified direction. In England, this often meant riding on the left, forcing peasants off to the right and into the mud. In 1300, Pope Boniface VIII issued an edict that pilgrims traveling to Rome should keep to the left side of the road. In Japan, samurai upheld a similar logic. Their katana, worn on the left, made it cumbersome to walk on the right. But let us return to Europe, to a land divided not by oceans, but by customs. For as the Middle Ages dawned, roads became more than pathways for travelers. They became arenas for power. The aristocracy rode in carriages splendid and wide. The poor walked. A document from 1722 tells U.S. that the Lord Mayor of London issued an official directive requiring all traffic to keep to the left on London Bridge, but not everyone followed suit. In France, a different story was unfolding. As carriages grew larger and trade more frequent, drivers began to sit on the left-hand rear horse. It was a small change, a practical one, and yet, as with all things French in the 18th century, it would take on revolutionary significance. By the time the French Revolution ignited in 1789, every symbol of aristocracy was despised. Where Napoleon conquered, traffic flowed to the right. Where Britain stood firm, it flowed to the left. The roads of Europe became maps of influence. You could trace the rise and fall of empires by watching the carts, carriages, and coaches. Even after Napoleon's fall, the rightward wave did not recede. Austria, Germany, Switzerland, and parts of Italy maintained the Napoleonic standard. Meanwhile, across the seas, Britain was spreading its own standard. In India, British administrators ensured left-side travel. As the British Empire rose to its peak, a strange contrast appeared across the map. The mother country, a simple thing, a traffic direction, had become a fault line. But perhaps the oddest case of all lies in the Americas. The newly formed United States had shaken off British rule by the late 18th century. And in doing so, it rejected more than just the crown. Americans began to favor right-side travel, especially as freight wagons grew larger. This practical logic became cultural defiance. By the early 1800s, Pennsylvania passed the first law requiring right-side driving. Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, they looked northward and mirrored the U.S. standard, and yet, even now, the world remains divided. This division is not random. It is the fossil record of political power, of conquest and colonization, of resistance and revolution. So next time you cross the street or step behind the wheel, pause. The side you stand on was chosen long before you were born. by a knight on horseback, by a Roman charioteer, by a revolutionary in Paris. The road remembers. And we, sleepers in motion, follow. The year was 1794. France, that ancient kingdom of chateaux and crowns, had been turned upside down. The revolution had devoured its monarchs. Guillotines clattered in public squares. It paints over centuries of practice with the bold colors of ideology. It was the peasants on foot or in ox-drawn carts who yielded, trudging through dust and dung on the right. There they were out of the way. There they belonged beneath the wheels of empire. And so what had once been a natural, almost subconscious preference for the left became, in France, a symbol of aristocracy, of privilege, of the old regime, and symbols were dangerous. Then came a man who would make it law, not just in France, but in nearly every land his boots set foot upon. A new world was being born from blood and fire, and in this world, even the side of the road one traveled was due for upheaval. You see, revolution does not only topple thrones, it rewrites habits, it questions the ordinary. In pre-revolutionary France, the nobility had customarily driven their carriages on the left, but the revolution promised equality. If the left side was the path of kings, then the right would become the road of the people, not because of necessity. But while the Romans spread their rule on the left, Napoleon carved his authority with the right, but because of empire. The scars of his rule remained etched in the very ruts and wheel tracks of the land. And thus, Paris and soon much of France switched sides. Not all at once and not without confusion. But by the turn of the 19th century, right-side travel was becoming common. Carriages swerved to the right, pedestrians adjusted. Confusion reigned at first, of course, but over time roads obeyed. His power was swift and absolute, and with it came a demand for uniformity. Military roads were no place for uncertainty. Supply lines, artillery columns, and cavalry units had to move with precision. That precision required standardization, but it declared clearly and finally all traffic in Britain would keep to the left. And when Napoleon's forces rolled across Europe into Belgium, the Netherlands, Switzerland, Italy, Poland, his road rules followed. Switzerland, right driving. Italy, once divided between right and left, slowly unified under the right. The Netherlands, France, and Germany all retained the Napoleonic standard. What had begun as a revolutionary gesture had become a practical fact. Napoleon Bonaparte, a general, a revolutionary, a man who crowned himself emperor in a cathedral once blessed by popes. So Napoleon, ever the tactician, declared that traffic must keep to the right. His traffic customs were just another imposition of continental arrogance. If he went right, they would go left. It began with his army, then with civilian convoys, then with entire towns and provinces. They learned to drive on the left because the mother country did. And once established, the habit stuck. Where the Corsican marched, left-side travel vanished. But a car barreling around a corner on the wrong side could kill. Not because of reason. Some drove on the left, others on the right. Border towns clashed. Accidents became common. It was the same tool Rome had once used, roads. In Prussia and Austria, in Spain and parts of Germany, French control brought more than new laws, it brought a new way of moving. And when Napoleon fell, when he was defeated and exiled, and Europe tried to stitch itself back together, the roads he changed did not revert. You can still see it today. Even in places where his armies had long since vanished, the rightward flow remained. Belgium, right driving. A tilt of the hand, a preference of the horseman, a rule of the soldier now embodied in concrete and steel. and in some ways a quiet tribute. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, the British watched in contempt. Signs must be reversed, vehicles replaced, minds retrained. Napoleon's rule was a threat to everything they held dear. And so they did. In 1835, the British Parliament passed the Highways Act. It was not flamboyant. It did not carry the fire of revolution. Where France had made the shift in the name of upheaval, Britain codified their custom in the name of order. Their empire followed suit. From Bombay to Brisbane, from Nairobi to Kingston, British engineers paved left-sided roads. The colonies did not question it. But back in Europe, a strange duality emerged. Take Austria, for example. Parts of it were deeply influenced by Napoleonic France. Other regions had resisted or fallen under different empires. By the early 20th century, Europe was a mess of sides. France and its neighbors drove on the right. Britain and its empire drove on the left. Scandinavia was split. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was a patchwork of directions. Then, as if history hadn't had enough chaos, the motorcar arrived. With it came speed, noise, accidents, the freedom to go anywhere and the risk of going the wrong way. Horses could be slowed. Wagons could turn. Suddenly, the question of left or right was no longer symbolic. It was urgent. Nations began to pass laws. Some switched sides entirely, especially those sandwiched between countries that drove on the opposite side. Others doubled down on tradition. But one thing was clear: Napoleon's shadow still loomed large. In Eastern Europe, his legacy defined the roads. It was a strange tribute. One man, in a whirlwind of conquest, had changed not just borders, not just monarchies, but the very rhythm of travel. And yet, even now, countries that once fought Napoleon fiercely still drive on the right? Because history, once it hardens into infrastructure, is hard to undo. To change the side of the road is no small matter. The ghost of Napoleon in this way rides with us still, just not on a horse. But on the highways, in the gentle arc of a curve, in the way we pass a stranger in the opposite lane. The war is over, but the direction he chose remains. The year was 1885, in a quiet conference hall in Berlin. The great powers of Europe gathered around polished tables and velvet maps. They did not come to settle wars, nor to broker peace, but to carve up the African continent like slices of cake at a colonial banquet. The Berlin Conference, dry in name, decisive in consequence. Lines were drawn across lands that had never known such boundaries. Kingdoms were split, rivers were ignored, cultures severed. And yet, even in this bureaucratic partition, something stranger was decided, not with words, but with wheels. Where the British Empire claimed land, the roads would flow to the left. Where the French, Belgians, or Germans held sway, the roads would follow the right. The roads, you see, became quiet messengers of imperial identity. From Canada to Kenya, from the Indian Raj to the Falkland Islands, British customs colonized as effectively as British soldiers. They brought English law, English schooling, English tea, and the practice of driving on the left. All blueprints, carriageway designs, and signal systems were built on the assumption of left-side travel. There was no room for ambiguity. Roads were systems of order, and in the far corners of the empire, order was everything. They whispered allegiance. They whispered control. And long after flags were lowered and independence declared, the roads would remain. In Ceylon, left-side traffic was enforced with British zeal, junctions controlled, headlights calibrated. The great European powers, bankrupted by 2 world wars, receded. The Union Jack was lowered. Tricolor flags were folded. New nations stood, proud and uncertain. and so the left-right divide hardened. What had once been a flexible tradition became a codified, iron-bound system. In Australia, new settlements were laid out with rules that mirrored London's. Independent in 1963, yet still driving on the left. Not because of nostalgia, but because of pragmatism. Even as India industrialized and expanded, it retained the direction of its former rulers, not out of loyalty, but inertia. To switch would be to dismantle and rebuild everything. A strange farewell, switching sides before becoming part of a nation already committed to the other direction. All its infrastructure, buses, signs, steering wheels, was built to British specification. Changing would cost millions. Re-educating drivers would take years. Despite Portugal's right-side norm, Mozambique drove on the left for decades to maintain harmony with its neighbors. When it broke from British rule in the early 20th century, it kept the left. The infrastructure had spoken. In Northern Ireland, still under UK governance, the same rule applied. But drive a few miles north into Ulster and the political map changes, though the road does not. And for what? The eastern provinces, once French or British colonies, originally drove on the left. But as the United States grew in power and population, cross-border trade increased. American cars, all configured for right-side driving, began to pour in. Even in Hong Kong, wedged between the traditions of China and the ambitions of the West, left-side driving became law. The left-hand rule was adopted not by force but by choice, a strategic alignment with the region's dominant power. The sun never set on the British Empire, a cliché but once true. But let us not mistake this as mere habit. It was calculated. British engineers tasked with building infrastructure in colonies were taught under the 1835 Highways Act, never colonized. But deeply rooted in samurai traditions, it had always favored left-side travel. When railways were introduced in the Meiji era, British companies helped build them, reinforcing the leftward logic. When cars arrived, Japan simply extended the tradition to roadways. So in India, bullock carts and bicycles began keeping to the left. The direction of travel was enforced by custom, not by signage, the way we move. The way we pass each other on highways at night. But as the 20th century dawned and cars began to purr and chug through the colonies, something happened. At first it was manageable. The governor has sailed. The soldiers have long since vanished. There were few cars. Most transport was slow, horse-drawn carts, rickshaws, oxen, with varying degrees of success and occasionally with results that are nothing short of spectacular. The side of the road became a commitment. Motor vehicles demanded structure, lanes had to be painted. And then the empires collapsed. One by one, colonies gained independence. But the roads remained. Nowhere was this more visible than in Africa. Take Kenya, for instance, the same in India. Though the British had departed in 1947, the left-hand rule remained, but not all nations held to the path. In Canada, for example, a curious conflict emerged. Gradually, province by province, Canada switched to the right. Newfoundland was the last holdout, clinging to left side, driving until 1947, just 2 years before it joined the Canadian Confederation. Ireland presents another enigma. Even more curious is Mozambique, a former Portuguese colony surrounded by left-driving countries like South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Tanzania. Then in 1928, Portugal ordered it to switch. A slow-motion chaos ensued. Cross-border travel became perilous. Trucks crashed, confusion reigned. And in time, Mozambique quietly reverted, joining the left again. Empires may fall. Flags may change. But roads are stubborn. What of the countries that were never colonized? Take Thailand, one of the few nations in Southeast Asia never to be ruled by Europe. And yet it drives on the left. Why? Because of influence. In the early 20th century, Thailand sought to modernize. British advisors were hired. British engineers built the roads. British vehicles were imported. In Japan, the same story with a different twist. It's fascinating, is it not? How empires leave their imprint not only in culture, language, and borders, but in the very flow of daily life. The side of the road you drive on can tell you who once ruled your land, who traded with your ports, who laid down your first rail line. It tells the story of conquest and cooperation, of inertia and influence, and it is not easy to change. To switch sides is not just a legal decision. It is a national operation, a symbolic rupture, a logistical nightmare. As we will see in the next part of our journey, some nations have tried. But for now, as you rest your head and drift into sleep, remember this: the empire is gone, but the road still remembers. And it whispers softly which side the past once stood on. It was a Monday, a cold, quiet morning in Stockholm. September 3rd, 1967, at exactly 4:50 a.m., the capital city stood still. Cars halted, buses idled, trams paused at their final stops. Pedestrians stood on sidewalks, watching. On this morning, Sweden was preparing to do something no country had ever attempted on such a scale. They were about to switch the side of the road. A complete national reversal. From left side to right side driving in a single day. A word so long it seems designed to lull the reader into slumber. And yet, beneath its bureaucratic title lay a moment of controlled madness. They called it Dagen H Day, short for Högertrafiken, the right-hand traffic diversion. Why would a modern, orderly country like Sweden make such a dramatic move? The answer, like all answers in this tale, begins with its neighbors. Sweden, an island of left-sided tradition, found itself increasingly out of sync with the world around it. Cross-border driving was treacherous. Visitors found themselves on the wrong side. Swedish cars were built with steering wheels on the left, suited for right-hand traffic, a mismatch that made overtaking extremely dangerous. Norway, Finland, and Denmark all drove on the right. It made no sense. And so, in 1963, the Swedish parliament voted to make the switch. The public, however, was fiercely opposed. But this wasn't a matter of preference anymore. It was a matter of safety, efficiency, and international integration. A referendum years earlier showed 83% of Swedes wanted to keep driving on the left. The government decided to proceed anyway and prepared for 4 years. They replaced 360,000 road signs. Police officers, military personnel, and volunteers stood at every corner. The roads of an entire nation shifted like the hands of a clock. They altered 20,000 intersections. They retrained every bus driver in the country. They even launched a massive national campaign. Television spots, radio jingles, posters, classroom lessons. The entire country learned a simple message. Within a week, traffic resumed its normal rhythm, but now in the opposite direction. Eight shall dig till Heiger, Svensson. Keep to the right, Mr. Svensson. And then, at the designated moment, 4:50 a.m., traffic came to a full stop. 10 minutes later, at exactly 5 a.m., drivers cautiously moved their vehicles from the left side of the road to the right. It was like watching a dance choreographed across thousands of cities, towns, and rural lanes. But Iceland faced one unique challenge: its remoteness. There was no pressing need to match neighbors, no border crossings to justify the switch. Astonishingly, the transition was smooth. There were fewer accidents on each day than a typical Monday. Rental cars, traffic signs, and accident rates demanded modernization. And so Iceland, like Sweden, flipped the system in a single, well-organized swoop. People drove slower, more carefully, unsure of their instincts, and in that hesitance, safety emerged. It was one of the greatest feats of national coordination in modern history. In 2009, the Samoan government decided to switch to the left. Most affordable used cars available to Samoa had right-side steering, suited for left-side roads. Lawsuits were filed. Angry citizens blocked roads. Banners reading, "We don't want to die," hung over intersections. Even churches chimed in, condemning the change as reckless. But Sweden was not alone in its ambition. Over the years, other countries have also switched sides, with varying levels of success and style. There were tiers. Drivers adapted quickly. They reveal something profound, how deeply habits run and how difficult it is to change them. Accidents remained low. The road, as always, absorbed the change and moved on. But once again, there was no chaos. And one morning, you must reverse every instinct. Muscle memory becomes a liability. Habit becomes hazard. Iceland, for instance, followed Sweden's example just 1 year later. In 1968, they called their version H-Dagurin, the H-Day of the North Atlantic. With a far smaller population and road network, the change was easier to implement. So why did they do it? Simple: tourism. As more foreign visitors arrived, particularly from the United States and Europe, the need to accommodate right-side driving became clear. But not all countries were so fortunate. Consider Samoa, a small Pacific island nation that had driven on the right for over a century, a legacy of German and American influence. Yes, to the left, not the right. Why? To align with Australia and New Zealand, major regional partners and sources of imported vehicles. The switch would make car imports cheaper and safer, but the reaction was furious. Protests broke out. But on September 7, 2009, at 6 a.m., the switch went ahead. There were prayers. In fact, the transition was almost anticlimactic. These moments, Sweden in 1967, Iceland in 1968, Samoa in 2009, stand as quiet marvels of logistics. Switching sides is not just about repaving roads or replacing signs. It is about rewriting reflexes. Imagine it now. You've spent decades turning left at intersections, glancing right at crosswalks, checking over your right shoulder to overtake. And yet, humans adapt. The brain, slow to adjust, eventually follows the lines on the road. And after a while, the new side feels normal. But not every country has the courage to attempt it. The cost is enormous. The planning immense. And the risk, well, it keeps many governments awake at night, so most nations simply stay the course. They inherit a direction and stick with it. Whether it came from colonial rule, geographic convenience, or revolutionary ideology, the side chosen becomes the side entrenched. And the longer it lasts, the harder it is to change. In this way, history traps us. Not in the grand speeches of leaders or the triumphs of armies, but in the turn of a wheel, the swing of a traffic light, the pause at a roundabout. The road, once chosen, becomes fate. And so, the next time you see a car easing into a turn, to the left or the right, consider this. You are watching history in motion. The result of revolutions, empires, and decisions made in smoke-filled rooms long before your time. You are, quite literally, driving through the past. Part 6. The American Drift. When the New World chose a side. The year is 1804. A freight wagon creaks down a muddy trail in Pennsylvania, pulled by 6 oxen, steered not by a wheel, but by a man on horseback riding the left rear animal of the team. His hands grip long leather reins. His eyes scan the horizon, watching for oncoming traffic, squinting through dust and heat. He pulls to the right side of the road, not because it's law yet, but because it makes sense. From his perch on the left rear ox sitting on the team's flank, the driver can more easily judge the distance between his massive wagon and oncoming carts if he stays to the right. And so he does, as do thousands of other freight drivers. There was no ancient road system, no entrenched custom of left-hand travel. Colonists brought habits from Britain, France, and the Netherlands, but nothing had yet been standardized, no royal edict. No revolution, just practicality. Early roads were narrow. Traffic was light, the decision didn't matter much. And in that slow, groaning drift of American wagons to the right, a continent begins to pick a side, where they could better see and judge the position of their wagons relative to oncoming traffic. Unlike Europe, where kings and emperors declared the rules of the road, the United States of America was young and experimental. The colonies, especially the 13 original states initially, followed the left-hand custom, as in England, but with the rise of commerce, everything changed. Wagons became bigger, trade routes more crowded. American drivers, often managing teams of horses without central seating, found it easier and safer to keep to the right. It allowed drivers to see oncoming traffic better while keeping to the right. It also placed passengers safely on the curbside when exiting, a practical consideration in the growing cities. And by the early 1800s, the shift was visible. In Pennsylvania, the state legislature passed one of the first right-hand driving laws in 1792, formally declaring the direction for wagon roads. New York followed. Then New Jersey, Ohio, Massachusetts. The eastern provinces like Ontario and Quebec originally drove on the left, following British tradition. But as trade with the United States intensified, complications arose. State by state, one by one, the right-hand system spread like a quiet tide, flowing westward with settlers and their wagons. And then came the great accelerant, the automobile. When Henry Ford introduced the Model T in 1908, he built it with the steering wheel on the left side. This design was deliberate. The importation of American cars built for right-hand driving only increased the mismatch. With the Model T's explosive popularity, Ford's layout became standard across the country and eventually across the globe. America's side was now official. But as American cars and commerce became dominant, they switched to the right in 1945. Right-hand driving, born from wagon logistics, affirmed by industrial mass production. And as America's influence grew, its standards spread across the Western Hemisphere. Canada was the first to feel the pressure. Though a British colony, Canada had a patchwork system in the 1800s. It required consistency, visibility, engineering precision. Steering wheels had to match road rules. Signage, lighting, intersections all had to follow a national standard. Crossing the border required drivers to switch sides within a few miles. Accidents became frequent. Travelers were confused. So slowly but surely, Canada switched. By 1920, most provinces had moved to right-side driving. By 1947, the last holdout, Newfoundland, joined the trend. It reflected the break with Britain, the rejection of monarchy, the rise of the machine. Left-side driving, by contrast, seemed old world, associated with colonialism and aristocratic habits. Even the small exceptions like British Guiana or Jamaica stood out as curiosities in a sea of conformity. Interestingly, Newfoundland didn't become part of Canada until 1949, but it had already made the switch 2 years earlier, anticipating its integration into a right-driving federation. Across the Americas, similar shifts played out. Argentina, once influenced by British rail and infrastructure, originally drove on the left. Mexico, long trading with the U.S., had adopted right-hand driving even earlier. Brazil, though largely influenced by Portugal, which drove on the right, formally cemented the practice in the early 20th century as its cities grew and American-style roadways expanded. It emerged from muddy roads, wagon drivers, and a growing appetite for movement. In these nations, the change wasn't always abrupt, but it was inevitable. It was the car, not the king, that dictated the direction. The automobile, born in the late 19th century, was no respecter of tradition. And so practicality once again overpowered history. But this wasn't just about traffic flow. It was about identity. Driving on the right became part of the American character, pragmatic, independent, innovative. And so, as American culture spread in the 20th century through Hollywood, highways and horsepower its side of the road became the default for the modern world. By the mid-20th century, most countries in the Americas drove on the right. But here's the twist. Even as the world bent toward uniformity, the left never disappeared. Australia, New Zealand, India, and Japan, among others, continued to drive on the left, forming their own network of influence. The world had not converged, but split. Two global systems, both deeply entrenched, and in each a reflection of who came before. In North America, the drift to the right was not a rebellion of law, but of logistics. It wasn't decreed by a monarch. It wasn't driven by ideology. And once forged, it stuck. Because roads, like rivers, are hard to reroute. Once they choose a direction, they carry generations with them. So, the next time you find yourself on a long stretch of highway, the white lines blinking past, the world humming softly beneath your tires, remember, the side you drive on wasn't chosen by you. It was chosen by a man on a horse, pulling a cart full of lumber, sometime around 1804, and you, centuries later, are still following his path. In the archipelago of Japan, change has always come like the tide, slow, deliberate, and inevitable. A land of warriors and emperors, of rice fields and paper screens, where the hum of the future never quite silences the footsteps of the past. And it is here, amid temples and towers, that we find one of the most enduring curiosities of the modern world. Japan drives on the left. So how did this fiercely independent nation end up on the same side of the road as Britain, India, and Australia? But why? Japan was never colonized, never absorbed into any European empire. No foreign flags flew above its palaces. No imperial highway was imposed. The warrior class, whose code of Bushido governed life, honor, and movement. The answer lies in the sheath of a sword. Centuries before cars, before trains, before asphalt, Japan was a land ruled by the samurai. Samurai, like their medieval counterparts in Europe, carried their swords on the left hip, always drawn with the right hand. This was not just preference, but tradition. And in a world where every gesture was a matter of respect or insult, walking to the left side of an approaching warrior avoided the clumsy clashing of hilts, samurai on horseback, peasants on foot. Couriers carrying messages for the shogun. The left side was not a law, but a rhythm. It was subtle, elegant, logical. British engineers, British equipment, British expertise, all imported across the sea. And with them came British traffic norms. Trains ran on the left track, just as they did in Britain. Roads, such as the legendary Tokaido, connecting Edo to Kyoto, were filled with travelers, soldiers, pilgrims, and merchants. Eager to modernize, the government sent emissaries abroad, hungry to learn from the industrialized nations of Europe. The tradition of left-hand travel persisted across centuries, reinforced by etiquette and reinforced by the ever-watchful eyes of local authorities. And so, without any proclamation, people in feudal Japan passed each other on the left. Timetables, switches, signals all had to conform to a single logic. And so, left-side rail traffic became the backbone of Japan's new industrial infrastructure. By the 17th century, the Tokugawa shogunate ruled a unified Japan. Then came the Meiji Restoration in 1868. It aligned rail, road, and regulation. Japan closed off from the West for over 200 years, opened its gates. Cars drove on the left, trams ran on the left. Buses picked up passengers from the left. They studied architecture, weaponry, education systems, and, crucially, railways. Korea, liberated by American forces, adopted right-hand traffic under U.S. influence. Taiwan, returned to Chinese governance, also flipped back to the right. Despite being a right-driving nation, America chose not to impose its standard. In territories like Taiwan, Korea, and parts of China, it imposed left-hand driving, roads were changed, directional rules enforced. And it was here that Japan made a decision that would shape its traffic forever. The government turned to Britain to help construct its first railway lines. In 1872, the first railway line was opened, from Shimbashi in Tokyo to Yokohama. Intact, its left-side roads are known for their order, cleanliness, and silence, an echo of the old samurai ways, wrapped now in neon and steel, unchallenged. This was more than coincidence. In countries like Kenya, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, the used car market is built almost entirely on imports from Japan, reinforcing left-side driving with economic inertia. It was the beginning of standardization. Railways required consistency. Then, as automobiles appeared in the early 20th century, they followed the tracks, literally. Early roads were often built alongside rail lines. And as traffic increased in cities like Tokyo and Osaka, the logic of the railway extended to the street. Still, this was not yet national law. It wasn't until 1924 that Japan officially codified left-hand traffic. The law was quiet, unceremonious, but it gave legal backing to a tradition already ingrained in Japanese motion. Japan had chosen, not through colonization, but through a blend of heritage, engineering, and observation. Interestingly, this decision would be tested in the fires of war. During World War II, Japan expanded across East Asia, but with Japan's surrender in 1945, these lands quickly reverted. However, Japan itself remained untouched in this regard. Even during the American occupation from 1945 to 1952, U.S. authorities did not alter the direction of traffic. Why? Because logistics trumped ideology. To switch Japan's traffic system would have required rewiring an entire nation, replacing road signs, retraining drivers, reversing vehicle imports, and reorienting infrastructure already ravaged by war. The U.S. had come to rebuild, not to disrupt further. And so Japan's left-side driving survived. Even today, Japan remains one of the most disciplined and efficient driving nations on Earth. And its cars? Well, they reflect its allegiance. Japanese cars built with right-hand steering wheels dominate left-driving markets: Britain, India, Australia, South Africa. Second-hand Japanese vehicles flood roads across Asia and Africa. In this way, Japan has become not just a participant in the left-hand tradition, but a pillar of its survival. Its traffic flows in harmony with its exports. Its roads mirror its rails. And its people, from the days of samurai to the age of Shinkansen, have moved quietly along the same side. So when you stand on a Japanese street corner waiting to cross, and you see a sea of cars gliding by on the left, remember this: you are not just watching traffic. You are watching 1,000 years of movement unbroken. A decision made not with fanfare but with instinct. Not with war, but with the subtle rhythm of swords and trains. The monsoon rains fall in waves over the city of Calcutta. Rickshaws splash through puddles, motorbikes weave between yellow taxis and on every road. Traffic flows to the left, chaotic, honking, relentless, but unmistakably aligned. India, vast and diverse, still drives on the left. And the reason, like much in the subcontinent, is rooted in a long, complex inheritance: the British Empire. But the story begins long before the British ever arrived. Like Japan, ancient India likely favored left-side travel. Hindu religious rituals, dating back thousands of years, emphasized keeping the right hand clean and sacred, while the left hand was considered impure, reserved for bodily hygiene and other unclean acts. Because of this deep cultural rule, walking to the left of others was seen as respectful, allowing one's right side, the side of greeting, eating and blessing, to remain unobstructed and visible. It remained a social reflex, not a legal requirement. Travelers on foot would naturally keep left, and early animal transport likely followed suit. But this cultural inclination was never codified. Not just on streets, but on the most transformative invention of the age, the railway. That changed in the 17th century when the British East India Company began carving trading posts into the Indian coastline. Bombay, Calcutta, Madras, outposts that would eventually grow into cities of millions. The company brought more than goods and guns. It brought British custom, including the left-hand rule of the road. The roads, many of them colonial projects, were constructed with British standards. Traffic laws were enforced by British officers. By the 19th century, as the British Raj took hold, the left-side system was firmly imposed across the growing network of colonial infrastructure. Platforms, switches, signals, and carriages were designed to fit a British system. No deviation, no debate. Unlike many former colonies who switched to right-hand driving after shedding their imperial chains, India chose continuity. India's first passenger train ran in 1853 from Bombay to Thane, powered by a steam engine and dreams of conquest. It ran like all British trains on the left track. Not out of ideology, but because British engineers built it, operated it, and trained Indian workers to maintain it. As the railway spread, reaching the Himalayas, the deserts of Rajasthan, the jungles of Kerala, the left side standard became embedded. The road systems, rudimentary but growing, were already aligned with left side conventions. To switch sides would mean rewiring the entire country signage, intersections, bus stops, vehicle imports, driver training, and police enforcement, a logistical nightmare. And soon the roads followed. Carriages and bullock carts gave way to motor cars imported from Britain and designed for right-hand steering. To suddenly adopt right-hand driving would make the existing fleet obsolete, an unaffordable risk for a country emerging from colonial rule and partition. By the early 20th century, the entire subcontinent moved to the left. From the crowded alleys of Delhi to the tea plantations of Assam, a switch would cause border confusion, especially in regions where cross-border movement was common. It might have been imposed, but the system worked. Even after independence in 1947, The newly sovereign Indian government chose not to change the direction of traffic. The choreography is frenetic, but within it lies an unspoken order. Why? There were several reasons. Its highways, clogged and chaotic though they may seem, are built with left-side engineering. Tourists might be confused, foreigners might fumble, but the locals never waver. Its domestic automotive industry, led by companies like Tata, Mahindra, and Maruti Suzuki, produce millions of right-hand steering vehicles for use in India and export to other left-driving nations. First, practicality. By 1947, India had over 50,000 kilometers of railway, all running on the left. India didn't just inherit the left, it mastered it. And cities, overwhelmed by vehicle growth, sometimes burst beyond their intended structures. Second, vehicles. The Indian market was dominated by British and Japanese cars, all built for left-hand traffic. Third, regional consistency. Most of India's neighbors, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Nepal, also drove on the left. So India stood firm. The legacy of empire, ironed into the roads and railways of the land, remained, and in time it became India's own tradition. Today, India operates the fourth largest railway system in the world, all left-aligned. And its legal codes, shaped by British precedent, continue to reference left-side road safety, passing conventions, and traffic behavior. But there's another layer to this persistence, one deeper, almost unconscious. India's traffic is not just infrastructure, it's theater. On a Delhi road, 1 million micro-negotiations happen every minute between rickshaw and pedestrian, bus and cow, scooter and stray dog. The left side isn't just a rule, it's the setting of the performance. And like all stages, once built, it's hard to reverse the direction of the play. Even in recent decades, as global commerce and travel bring new models and mindsets to India, the left side standard holds. You see it in how buses load passengers, in how tuk-tuks position themselves at intersections, in how drivers instinctively drift left to overtake from the right. It's muscle memory. It's national muscle. And in a strange way, it's become a point of pride, not of colonial obedience, but of post-colonial competence. Of course, there are quirks. Some rural areas, poorly policed or informally organized, may exhibit ambivalence toward lanes altogether. But the core direction remains intact, because even chaos needs a compass. And India's compass, forged in temples, rail tracks, and traffic lights, points to the left. So the next time you're navigating the maze of Indian roads, honking your way past cows and chai stalls, remember, you are driving in the shadow of empire, yes, but also in the rhythm of something older, deeper. A nation that moves forward, always forward, on the left side of history. The continent of Africa is a tapestry of tribes, languages, landscapes, and legacies. Yet when viewed through the lens of a map of traffic direction, it becomes something else entirely, a patchwork of left and right, stitched not by local tradition, but by the invisible hands of European empires. When lines were carved across the continent not by rivers or ridges, but by rulers literal and political. Britain, France, Germany, Portugal, Belgium, and others carved out territories with little regard for native kingdoms or natural boundaries. To understand why some African countries drive on the left and others on the right, you must return to the age when maps were drawn in boardrooms, not deserts. Roads few and far between, though they were designed to accommodate British vehicles, with right-hand steering, driving on the left. Native populations were often forbidden from using these roads freely, but the system that would later serve them was laid down with imperial intent. The scramble for Africa, which began in earnest in the late 19th century, brought a tidal wave of colonial ambition to the continent. And with each empire came its own rules, including, quite literally, the rules of the road. So did the Germans, the Italians, and the Belgians. The British Empire, staunch in its adherence to left-hand traffic, imposed its system wherever it went. South Africa, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Zimbabwe, and others. In these territories, early infrastructure was largely built to serve imperial needs: railways to extract minerals, roads to move troops, and bridges to connect plantations to ports. Road direction was never debated, it was imposed. Others, wary of the logistical nightmare and costs involved, stayed the course. Across the colonial border, however, things could be entirely different. The French, who controlled vast swaths of West and Central Africa, brought their own standard, right-hand traffic. The campaign was called Keep Right Gunna, and it involved a nationwide overhaul, retraining drivers, repainting roads, replacing signs, and adjusting vehicle imports. The result? A continent with no natural traffic rhythm of its own, but a geographic collage of inherited habits. The operation was surprisingly smooth, a tribute to the country's preparation and to the public's discipline. But inertia, cost, and compatibility with surrounding left-driving regions like Ghana and Sierra Leone often held such plans at bay. A declaration of independence, not just from Britain, but from isolation. Its extensive road infrastructure, railway network, and domestic automobile industry all conformed to left-hand norms. Changing would have meant rewriting decades of development. A bid to integrate more fully with its West African neighbors. There are often no formal traffic transition systems, just makeshift signs and the watchful eyes of local police. But in 1974, the government decided to switch to the right, aligning itself with its neighbors, most of whom had been colonized by France and drove on the right. Take East Africa, for example. In Kenya and Tanzania, British control meant left-hand traffic, a legacy that survives today. These cars are cheaper, more efficient, and often second-hand. But on Rwandan roads, they are technically on the wrong side, causing safety concerns and insurance complications. But in the 2000s, its government explored the possibility of switching to left-hand traffic, not for ideological reasons, but economic ones. Just south, Mozambique, once ruled by Portugal, drives on the right. But the very fact it was considered shows how deeply vehicle trade now influences traffic direction, in some places, more than colonial history ever did. Yet directly to the west, Zambia, another British colony, drives on the left. The borders may be arbitrary, but the steering wheel tells you who once ruled. For a time, colonial powers dictated everything. But when independence swept across Africa in the mid-20th century, newly formed nations had a choice to make: maintain the colonial road direction or switch. Some countries, eager to shed all remnants of colonialism, changed sides. And the right in the next, depending on which old colonial road you're following. One of the most telling examples of this tension is Ghana. A former British colony, Ghana inherited left-hand traffic. It was a massive undertaking. On the morning of the switch, traffic was halted at 5 a.m. At 6 a.m., vehicles slowly began moving on the right. Ghana's choice was not just practical, it was symbolic. Other former British colonies considered the same shift. Nigeria, for instance, long debated whether to join the right-hand fold. Meanwhile, South Africa, a major British stronghold, never seriously entertained a switch. To this day, South Africa remains the anchor of left-side driving in Africa and a source of left-hand vehicles exported throughout the southern part of the continent. But here's the twist. In many African countries, especially those with porous borders and informal economies, both systems coexist, sometimes even on the same road. In remote border towns, where trade vehicles cross from left-driving Mozambique into right-driving Malawi, or from Tanzania into the Democratic Republic of Congo, drivers must adapt quickly. In places like Rwanda, the story takes yet another turn. Rwanda, colonized by Germany and later Belgium, has always driven on the right. You see, Rwanda imports most of its cars from Japan, where vehicles are built for left-hand driving, i.e. steering wheels on the right. So, in 2009, Rwanda considered flipping to the left, not to match its neighbors, but to match its cars. In the end, the plan was shelved, likely due to the massive infrastructure overhaul it would require. Today, if you drive across Africa, you'll find a continent split, not in ideology or culture, but in the phantom footprints of empire. In Kenya, you drive on the left because Queen Victoria's flag once flew over Nairobi. In Ivory Coast, you drive on the right because Napoleon's descendants once called it La Quête de Voar. And in the deserts of Namibia, you might drive on the left in one village. It's a map of history and motion. A cartography of conquest you can only read at 60 kilometers per hour. So next time you cross the border in Africa, pause for a moment, look at the road. Then ask yourself, which empire taught this country to drive? Because in Africa, traffic does not just flow through cities and fields, it flows through centuries. And it always remembers where it came from. Tourists and truckers from Europe arrived with right-hand drive habits and vehicles, only to be forced into an unfamiliar system the moment they crossed into Sweden, Norway, Finland, Denmark, Germany. These cars were built to be driven on the right side of the road, so using them in Sweden meant that the driver sat dangerously close to the curb rather than the center line. This meant that border crossings were hazardous. National media blanketed the airwaves with warnings, jingles, cartoons, and infographics. The government even distributed millions of pairs of driving gloves with arrows pointing right just to remind people. Even worse, most Swedes drove left-hand drive vehicles imported from Germany, Italy, or the United States. Speed limits were reduced. People drove slowly, paid attention, hesitated more. Visibility, overtaking, and road safety suffered. The accident rate climbed. Generations had grown up with it, but in 1963, the Swedish parliament voted to make the switch. It would take 4 years of preparation, and it would cost a fortune. Public opinion initially resisted a change. People were used to the left. Signs had to be replaced, roads repainted, buses rebuilt. Traffic lights repositioned, driver education restructured. It too passed without major incident. Like Sweden, Iceland's neighbors and main trading partners all drove on the right. Switching helped commerce and safety. And then, on that early morning in 1967, the country switched. With air travel increasing and international shipping expanding, the need for cross-border driving consistency grew. It was a paradox. By disrupting their instincts, the government made them safer, at least for a while. Sweden's example sparked conversations around the world. Its own island geography, self-sufficient automobile industry, and historical leanings toward the left made it a permanent member of the left driving club. But it tried to encourage clarity and signage uniformity to reduce accidents for international drivers. Could other countries switch? Should they? And culturally, it saw no reason to follow the continent. Nigeria, meanwhile, a former British colony, considered switching to the right after independence, hoping to align with its francophone neighbors. Ghana, as mentioned earlier, successfully switched in 1974. Switching to the left allowed cheaper car imports, better spare parts access, and easier vehicle maintenance. Each country that switched faced the same dilemma: historical habit versus modern reality. Sometimes history wins, sometimes reality does. It was during this era that the United Nations began urging global traffic harmonization. The Vienna Convention on Road Traffic, signed in 1968, didn't mandate a global standard. Still, there was no consensus on which side of the road should pick. So the division remained and in many cases hardened. But most of continental Europe, having long driven on the right, remained firmly rooted. And in former colonies, the choice of direction often became a quiet referendum on colonial identity. Drive on the left, and you're reminded of British rule. Drive on the right, and you join the modern European order. Yet not all switches were about empire or economy. Sometimes they were about geography. Take Samoa in the Pacific. In 2009, this small island nation became the first country in decades to switch from right-hand traffic to left. It was one of the only modern reversals. Why? Because most of Samoa's vehicles were imported from Australia, New Zealand, and Japan, all left-hand driving countries. There was opposition. There were protests. But the government went ahead, even banning alcohol sales for 3 days around the switch, just to be safe. And the result? The country adjusted. Because ultimately, driving is not just about roads or vehicles, it's about people. And people, despite their stubborn habits, can adapt. The 1960s showed us something profound. That even the most mundane habits, like which side of the road we use, are not inevitable. And with enough will, enough planning, and enough signage, a nation can flip its instincts overnight. The steering wheel may be on the right, But the future? That's up for negotiation. In the land of revolutions, rebellion didn't stop at the throne. It extended to taxes, tea, and, curiously enough, traffic. Long before the clamor of muskets at Lexington or the parchment of the Declaration of Independence, American colonists drove their carriages on the left, just like their British counterparts. It was the natural order of things. Wagons hugged the left shoulder. Riders passed each other to the right. The roads, such as they were, followed the ancient rhythm of the empire. But after 1776, that rhythm began to change. And by the early 19th century, the United States had flipped to the right. Quietly, steadily, stubbornly. No central decree, no single each day like Sweden. Just a growing resistance to British customs and a fascination with French ideas. Rejecting the monarchy wasn't enough. Every day, life needed to be scrubbed clean of British habits. Spelling, accents, and yes, even the side of the road. Why did America switch sides? Drawn by teams of horses or oxen, they were too large for one man to sit in a conventional driver's seat. The answer, like most of American history, is a cocktail of ideology, economics, and horses. From that position, it made sense to keep to the right side of the road. It gave them a better view of oncoming traffic and more room to judge clearance. After independence, there was a cultural appetite to distinguish American life from British tradition. At the same time, something new was rumbling down America's dirt tracks: Conestoga wagons. These were massive freight wagons used for transporting goods across the expanding frontier. Instead, drivers sat on the left rear horse, using their right hand to wield a whip. It was a deliberate break from aristocratic norms, where nobles rode on the left and forced commoners aside. In Napoleon's France, everyone, soldier and citizen, would ride on the right, a symbol of equality. The French Revolution, despite its guillotine-laced chaos, was admired by many Americans as a cousin of their own. Thus began the slow migration toward right-hand traffic in the Midwest and frontier territories. And in a twist of geopolitical irony, America, though never under Napoleon's rule, admired France's bold, modern spirit. States like Pennsylvania, home of the Conestoga wagon, became early adopters. In 1792, Pennsylvania passed one of the first known traffic laws requiring drivers to keep to the right. Other states followed. By the early 1800s, the trend was clear. The young republic was choosing the right. New York, Virginia, and even southern states aligned their laws accordingly. Canada, still a British colony, maintained left-hand traffic, creating the earliest road confusion at the U.S.-Canada border. But it wasn't just American-made wagons pushing the shift. It had a left-hand steering wheel, meant to be driven on the right side of the road. There was another influence, subtle, powerful, revolutionary: France. Countries like Mexico, Argentina, Chile, and Brazil looked northward for cars, road models, and highway systems. All were designed for right-hand use. In post-revolutionary France, Napoleon Bonaparte implemented right-hand traffic across his empire. The automobile industry became the final nail in the coffin of left-hand traffic in the United States. As Napoleon conquered Europe, this system spread: Belgium, the Netherlands, parts of Germany, Poland, and Italy. Why? The exact reason is unclear, perhaps due to Danish habits or early vehicle imports from the British Caribbean. But even more confusing, most vehicles there are left-hand drive, imported from the U.S. Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and other American founders had deep ties with Paris, so when Americans looked for models of modernity, they often looked to France, not Britain. He also wanted passengers to enter and exit the car onto the curb, not into traffic. The symbolic message was clear: right is Republican, left is loyalist. By the mid-1800s, nearly every U.S. state had adopted right-hand traffic laws. But it wasn't until the rise of the automobile that things became truly standardized. Enter Henry Ford. In 1908, Ford released the Model T, the first mass-produced car in history. Why? Ford believed that having the driver seated on the left made it easier to judge passing distances and see oncoming vehicles. With the Model T's explosive popularity, America's flirtation with left-side driving ended for good. And America wasn't alone in its influence. Latin American countries, following the United States' commercial and infrastructural lead, began adopting right-hand traffic as well. By the mid-20th century, right-hand traffic had become the norm across nearly the entire Western Hemisphere, save for a few Caribbean islands, like Jamaica and Barbados, which remained loyal to their British driving legacy. But in the U.S., there's one peculiar place where left-hand traffic still exists, or at least used to. The U.S. Virgin Islands, a territory acquired from Denmark in 1917, is one of the only parts of America where cars drive on the left. So you end up with a bizarre, often disorienting mix: American cars but British roads. Tourists beware. This isn't entirely unique either. Several Caribbean nations drive on the left while using left-hand drive vehicles, because the majority of their imports come from North America. It's a logistical compromise, one that leads to higher accident rates but lower import costs. So what does all this say about America? It says that even a habit as small as which side you drive on can be shaped by revolution, rebellion, and industrial force. In rejecting Britain, Americans didn't just write new constitutions, they rewrote their traffic rules. In embracing France and forging their own path, they made a practical choice into a political one. And when Ford built his factory in Detroit, he didn't just produce cars, he cemented the American way of driving, forever on the right. And so, when you glide along a quiet interstate at dawn, headlights chasing the horizon, you're not just on a highway, you're on a historical current, one that flows away from monarchies toward manifest destiny. You're not just steering a car, you're steering a legacy, and it's turning right. Stand on a road in Kenya, watch the traffic flow, cars on the left, steering wheels on the right. The same is true in India, Malaysia, South Africa, Australia, all far-flung lands, all thousands of miles from Buckingham Palace. And yet, all still drive on the left. It's a ghost of empire cast in asphalt. The British Empire, once so sprawling it was said the sun never set upon it, left behind railways, schools, bureaucracies, and traffic patterns. Wherever British engineers laid roads, left-hand traffic followed. It was standardized, codified, and taught. Local populations were trained to drive accordingly. Vehicles were imported from Britain with right-side steering wheels. Signs, intersections, and signals all mimicked those back home. And when independence came one by one, these nations raised new flags, but many did not switch sides. Why? It involves. The answer lies in a strange tangle of practicality, economics, and post-colonial psychology. Let us begin with the practical. Changing which side of the road a nation drives on is not simple. Rebuilding intersections, replacing or modifying vehicles, rewriting driver education materials, changing signage and lane markings, retraining bus and taxi operators. For large countries with poor infrastructure and limited budgets, such as many newly independent post-colonial nations, the cost was staggering. Reconfiguring one-way streets and roundabouts, and most critically, re-educating millions of drivers. Its thriving auto industry, with cars designed for left-hand traffic, provided affordable vehicles to many ex-British colonies. Used Japanese cars flooded into Africa, Southeast Asia, and Oceania, reinforcing left-hand driving norms. It's an enormous logistical undertaking. Even small countries, like Samoa, spent years preparing for their 2009 switch. India, for example, inherited left-hand traffic from British rule in 1947, but with thousands of miles of road, a vast and growing population, and millions of left-hand vehicles already in use, switching was nearly impossible. And so India, like Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Nepal, remained left-driving. Ghana, for example, switched to right-hand traffic in 1974, decades after independence, partly to align with its neighbors, but also as a gesture of post-colonial autonomy. A secondary trade system emerged, a post-colonial highway of vehicles, spare parts, and driving customs. Colonial legacy or not, the system worked. Roads were in place, driving culture was established. A change would only bring chaos. Their settler colonial status, cultural alignment with Britain, and robust domestic car industries made the system feel native, not foreign. For them, driving on the left wasn't a burden, it was simply how things were done. So they kept the system intact, not out of loyalty to empire, but out of stability. The economic case followed naturally. Countries that drove on the left tended to import cars from each other, which drives on the right the company must adapt. That means extra vehicles, custom logistics, and border switching points. Japan, another left-driving nation, became a key player. Road safety campaigns in left-driving nations often focus on foreign visitors, who are statistically more likely to cause accidents. It created a cycle. Nations that drove on the left traded with each other, bought from each other, and, in doing so, locked themselves into that pattern. But underneath the economics was something more complex: identity. For many former colonies, the question of which side to drive on was tied up in a deeper struggle, a question of whether to embrace or reject the colonial legacy. Why? Because all its neighbors, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Malawi, Tanzania, drive on the left? Thailand chose the left, possibly due to early influence from Britain and Japan, and stuck with it, even as neighbors like Cambodia and Laos flipped. For regional trade and travel, it simply makes more sense. The rest, the overwhelming majority, drive on the right. Some saw left-hand traffic as an inherited scar, a reminder of foreign rule. These countries sought to erase it. Nigeria considered switching in the 1970s, but the costs were too high, and the plan was abandoned. Other countries, like Malaysia, embraced a more pragmatic stance. Still others, like Australia and New Zealand, retained left-hand traffic with little debate. But then there were the borderlands, the nations caught between worlds. Take Mozambique. These choices, often made decades ago, continue to shape economies and relationships today. A trucking company in Botswana, for example, will buy left-hand drive trucks to match its own system. But if it wants to do business in the Democratic Republic of Congo, even tourism is affected. Rental car companies in South Africa or Kenya routinely warn tourists from right-hand countries about the adjustment. And yet, despite the risks, few countries change. Because traffic habits, like most things in a nation's psyche, are deeply embedded. To change it is to unwrite millions of tiny decisions made daily without thinking. It's possible, as Sweden, Ghana, and Samoa have shown, but it comes at a cost, which is why the world, by and large, remains split. Roughly 35% of the world's population drives on the left, across countries that represent just 25% of the world's roads. And yet those left-hand nations form a kind of invisible network, former colonies, island states, trading partners, tourist destinations, all orbiting the legacy of an empire long gone. And as strange as it may seem, that legacy is preserved not in monuments or museums, but in the daily act of turning left at a roundabout. So the next time you're in Mumbai or Nairobi or Brisbane, you're not just obeying a traffic law. You're stepping into history, not with speeches or songs, but with a blinker, a yield, and the quiet hum of tires against pavement. Far across the Pacific, where cherry blossoms drift like forgotten snow, a land untouched by colonizers quietly chose to drive on the left, not because of conquest, not because of British rule, but because of samurai and trains. Welcome to Japan, where the story of left-hand traffic is not one of foreign domination, but of pragmatism, precision, and pride. Japan was never colonized. It was never forced to choose between British left and French right. And yet, today, it remains one of the largest left-hand driving nations on Earth, along with India, Indonesia, and the UK itself. How did that happen? The answer winds through ancient horseback customs, Meiji-era industrialism, and a pivotal partnership with British rail engineers. Let's begin where it all started, on the Tokaido Road during the Edo period. Japan was a closed and orderly society ruled by the Tokugawa shogunate. The shoguns enforced strict control over movement, trade, and warfare. Roads were heavily policed, travel was monitored, and certain behavioral codes developed over time. One of these: keep to the left. Travelers on Japan's main roads, particularly the Tokaido, which linked Kyoto to Edo in feudal Japan, such unspoken norms carried more weight than decrees, were instructed to pass each other on the left-hand side. This was especially practical for samurai, who carried their swords on the left hip. Passing on the left meant swords wouldn't T-clash or bump, a very real concern in a society where sword etiquette was tied to status, pride, and deadly duels. It wasn't a formal law, but it was a deeply ingrained custom, reinforced over centuries. They imported British locomotives, British parts, and critically, British driving norms. But the real transformation came in the late 19th century, when Japan began its astonishing leap into modernity, the Meiji Restoration. And once the railway network began to sprawl across the archipelago, it brought with it a powerful kind of standardization. Eager to catch up with Western powers, Japan sent delegations abroad, hired foreign advisors, and began to industrialize at lightning speed. Horse-drawn carts, pedestrians, and later cars aligned themselves to the left, simply because that was how the railroads operated. One of its top priorities, railroads, it wasn't an imperial imposition. It was a deliberate domestic choice, influenced by practicality and consistency. In 1872, Japan built its first railway line, connecting Tokyo to Shinbashi. And who helped them build it? The British. British engineers oversaw the early railway projects. British trains, like their roads, ran on the left-hand track. That system was replicated in Japan. Toyota, Honda, Nissan all manufactured vehicles with right-hand steering wheels, suited for left-hand driving, not just for trains, for everything. Now, left-hand traffic was no longer just a colonial relic. It was part of modern economic alignment. As Japan grew into a mechanized society, people began to mimic railway behavior in everyday traffic. In 1900, Japan passed its first formal traffic laws, codifying left-hand travel as the national standard. For over 2 decades, Okinawans drove on the right, while the rest of Japan drove on the left. Unlike in former colonies, where left-hand traffic was often a leftover, in Japan, it was an active decision. And once that decision was made, Japan doubled down. The automobile boom of the 20th century saw Japan emerge as a global powerhouse. For hours, crews worked feverishly to flip signs, repaint lines, redirect buses, and guide confused drivers through a mirror world of familiar roads. By mid-century, Japanese cars were not only filling Japan's roads, they were flooding export markets, especially in former British colonies across Asia and Africa. This created a second wave of influence. Countries like Kenya, Sri Lanka, and Malaysia, which drove on the left due to British history, began importing Japanese cars because they were affordable, durable, and designed for their roads. Its roads are famously clean, its drivers disciplined, and its traffic systems technologically advanced. In doing so, they reinforced their left-hand systems, often long after the empire that started it had vanished. Japan, in this sense, became a post-colonial colonizer of traffic norms, not by force, but by commerce. Even nations with ambiguous driving histories, like Indonesia, gradually adopted left-hand systems under Japanese economic influence, especially during the 1970s and 1980s. But Japan's left-hand identity wasn't without its quirks. Consider Okinawa. After World War II, Okinawa was occupied by the United States, which enforced right-hand traffic on the island, aligning it with American norms. But in 1972, Okinawa was returned to Japanese control. The result? A logistical nightmare. The government launched an ambitious project called Nana 10, the day when Okinawa would switch back to left-hand traffic. On that day, all traffic stopped at 6 a.m. The operation involved 13,000 road signs, 200 buses, and more than 1,000 traffic controllers. And yet, it was a resounding success. Okinawa rejoined the rest of Japan, not just politically, but directionally. The event has become something of a legend in traffic engineering, an example of how even deep-seated habits can be reversed with planning, unity, and a lot of cones. Today, Japan continues to stand as one of the most efficient left-hand driving nations on Earth. But beneath the electronic toll gates and punctual taxes is a much older rhythm. The rhythm of samurai avoiding clashing scabbards, of British-built locomotives steaming across rice fields, of a nation that chose not to follow the right or reject the left, but to craft its own path, shaped by utility, honor, and adaptation. So, if you ever ride the Shinkansen, streaking silently through Japanese countryside at 320 kilometers per hour, know that you are gliding on a legacy, not just of trains and tracks, but of swords, steam, and subtle choices, all quietly leaning ever so slightly to the left. Most nations choose a side and stay with it. Left or right, once the lines are painted and the rules are taught, they tend to stick. But a few countries, rare and daring, have done something almost unthinkable. They've switched sides, overnight, across entire populations. One morning you drive on the left, the next on the right. It sounds absurd, dangerous, impossible. And yet, it has been done successfully, sometimes even beautifully. Let us begin with the most famous example, Sweden, 1967. The Swedes called it Dagen H, short for Högertrafikering, the right-hand traffic diversion. At the time, Sweden drove on the left, a tradition dating back centuries. But all of its neighbors, Norway, Finland, Denmark, drove on the right. The border roads switched sides, often abruptly, leading to accidents. Swedish cars were mostly left-hand drive, imported from Europe or America. This meant drivers sat on the same side as the curb, reducing visibility for overtaking. Worse still, Swedes crossed into Norway or Finland regularly. The decision was made, Sweden would switch. Posters, radio jingles, television spots, even underwear printed with H-Day slogans were sold. Every Swede knew the date. The date, September 3rd, 1967, traffic signals were rotated. Lane markings were repainted under cover of night. The time, what followed was one of the most meticulously planned operations in traffic history. Months before the event, a massive public awareness campaign began. Hundreds of intersections were redesigned. Thousands of road signs were replaced or covered with black plastic to be unveiled at dawn. On the morning of the switch, all non-essential traffic was banned from the roads between 1 a.m. and 6 a.m. at 4:50 a.m. Every car in Sweden was instructed to pull over and stop. The Dagen age proved that a full switch was possible with enough planning, discipline, and collective effort. At 4:55, they slowly moved to the opposite side of the road, guided by police and volunteers. Why? Because drivers were suddenly more cautious. They paid more attention, speeding declined. Pedestrians, too, were extra alert. At 5 a.m., Sweden officially became a right-hand driving nation. And the result? Iceland's small population and simple road network made the change manageable, fewer accidents. In the days and weeks following the switch, traffic collisions dropped sharply. Drivers often ignored regulations. While the transition was managed, it wasn't as smooth as Sweden's. Accidents spiked briefly, but the long-term benefit was regional alignment. Having gained independence from Britain in 1957, Ghana sought to align itself more with its francophone and right-driving neighbors. Of course, the accident rate crept back up over time, but Sweden wasn't the first, nor the last. Let's journey back to Iceland just a year later. On May 26, 1968, they followed Sweden's lead with Dagen V for Vinstra. Just like in Sweden, the switch went smoothly. It was cheaper thanks to borrowed Swedish planning models. But most of its neighbors, like Australia and New Zealand, drove on the left. Samoans also imported thousands of used vehicles from Japan, all with right-side steering wheels, designed for left-hand driving. The change made economic sense, lowered car prices, and improved vehicle safety. Then there's Ghana 1974. Legend has it that General Ne Win ordered the nation to drive on the right overnight, supposedly advised by his astrologer. Unlike the Nordic nations, Ghana's decision to switch from left to right had post-colonial undertones. On August 4, 1974, the change was made. Then, in a carefully choreographed move, drivers crossed over. 2 days of public holiday were declared. Alcohol sales were banned. The country remains a right-driving, right-hand steering contradiction to this day. The cost was too high. Public resistance was strong. Like many others, they chose inertia over reinvention. Speed limits were cut in half. Police flooded the streets. Churches prayed. You learn it young, you live by it daily. It becomes invisible until someone tries to change it. But Ghana's roads were chaotic, underdeveloped, and poorly lit. Protests erupted. The public feared accidents, chaos, even economic disaster. But the government persisted. Other African nations considered the same: Nigeria, Uganda, Tanzania. but the costs and logistics were daunting. Most decided to keep their inherited systems. Then in the Pacific Ocean, Samoa, 2009, an island nation with just 180,000 people, Samoa had driven on the right for decades, a legacy of American influence. The mismatch created safety risks and limited trade. So, on September 7, 2009, Samoa did the impossible. It flipped to the left. The announcement sparked outrage. At 6 a.m., all traffic paused, and it worked. Samoa became the first country in over 30 years to change sides. But not every attempt was successful. In Burma, a switch in 1970 was sudden, poorly planned, and possibly astrological. The result? Mayhem. Vehicles still had right-side steering, as in left-driving countries. Visibility became a problem. Overtaking was dangerous. Thailand, too, considered switching in the 1980s, but never did. What all these cases reveal is this: changing driving sides is never just about traffic. It's about identity, trade, regional politics, and the national psyche. To drive on the right or left isn't just a mechanical choice. It's a habit, a memory, a shared ritual. And when they do, what emerges is not chaos, but something deeper. The ability of a society to adapt, to work together, to move in unison, to accept that something as ordinary as a painted line can reflect who they are and who they wish to be. So when you next cross a border and the traffic flips, remember, you're not just changing lanes. You're passing through a portal in history, a line drawn not only on roads but in the heart of a nation. It is perhaps one of the last global divides that sparks no war, causes no outrage, and inspires no rallies. There are no banners, no chants, no treaties, and yet the world remains quietly, persistently split. Into those who drive on the left and those who drive on the right. You might call it a trivial distinction, just a matter of traffic flow, a mere quirk of design. But beneath the surface, it reveals something deeper, a map not only of colonial memory and cultural inheritance, but of how nations see themselves in relation to others. Today, roughly 65% of the world's population drives on the right. The remaining 35%, including Japan, the UK, Australia, India, South Africa, and many former British colonies, drive on the left. It's not a neat division of east and west, north or south. It is messy, asymmetric, and filled with curious exceptions. The Americas, for example, are almost universally right-driving, a legacy of French, Spanish, and American influence. Only a few small Caribbean nations like Jamaica, Barbados, and Suriname remain on the left islands of difference in the sea of right-hand traffic. Britain, once the epicenter of a globe-spanning empire, now finds itself an island of left-handedness in a continent of rightward flow. Europe is overwhelmingly right-driving except for the UK, Ireland, Cyprus, and Malta. Africa is sharply divided along colonial lines. Cross-border truck drivers often keep a mental switch in their heads, flipping instinctively as they cross invisible lines. Southern nations, Kenya, Tanzania, South Africa, inherited Britain's left, but much of West Africa, influenced by France and Portugal, drives on the right. The result? Asia is even more fragmented. India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Japan all drive on the left. Never colonized, yet it drives on the left. But they themselves continue to drive on the left, a lingering legacy of British and Portuguese rule. Why? Because its early cars came from Britain and Japan, both left-driving nations. Take Indonesia, a former Dutch colony, but influenced more heavily by Japan during World War II and afterward. The lines may seem arbitrary, but each carries the fingerprint of history. But China, South Korea, Vietnam, and most of Central Asia drive on the right. The reasons are rarely recent. They are echoes of old empires, trading partners, and military occupiers. Take Thailand. The road loops and twists, guiding drivers gently from left to right or vice versa, like threading a needle between histories. Or consider Hong Kong and Macau, both now part of China, which drives on the right. In right-driving nations, it's the opposite. What about border crossings? But it affects everything from how mail is delivered to which side you enter a bus, to how toll booths, drive-thrus, and highway exits are designed. Where two countries drive on opposite sides, engineers have devised an elegant solution, the grade-separated crossover. At these junctions like the Takatu Bridge or the Lotus Bridge, and what of the vehicles? In left-driving countries, the steering wheel is on the right, placing the driver nearer the center of the road for better visibility. This might seem like a small detail. In countries where vehicle imports are mismatched to driving rules, such as Myanmar, where right-hand drive cars are used on right-hand roads, the results can be hazardous or at least inconvenient. One that shifts and flows, not with conquest now, but with commerce, convenience, and culture. For large countries like India, Australia, or Japan, the disruption would span generations. Now and then the question is raised, should the world standardize, crossover bridges, adaptive logistics, export industries adjust? Should we pick one side, left or right, and slowly migrate toward global uniformity? In theory, perhaps. In practice, almost certainly not. The cost would be astronomical. Road signage, intersections, vehicles, driver training, public education, all would need to be replaced, retrained, and rebuilt. But more than that, there is no real need. Unlike currency, time zones, or electrical plugs, driving sides don't have to match across borders. There are systems in place. And so the world continues, gently divided but peacefully so. In some sense, it is poetic, a reminder that not all differences must be resolved. Some can simply be respected. That the way we drive, like the way we write or speak or eat, can reflect a living history. And perhaps that's why the left-right divide has endured so long, because it is not a problem to be solved, but a story to be told. A story of Rome and its legions, of samurai and scabbards, of Napoleon's ambition, of British steam trains rattling through tropical colonies. It's a story of switchovers and standoffs, of decisions made in midnight cabinets and dusty barracks, of everyday people adjusting to the turn of the wheel. And now, when you find yourself in a strange country, crossing the street and hesitating for just a second, you're brushing against that very story, the invisible history of traffic. A habit older than your lifetime, older than your car, older than your country, perhaps. So the next time you step into a taxi in London or Tokyo or Nairobi and you see the driver sitting on the wrong side, smile. You're not in the wrong lane. You're in another timeline. Another half of the world. Not right, not wrong. Just left.